Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about my favorite all-time stem plant, and that is this plant right here, widely known as mermaid weed. The scientific name of this plant is Proserpinica palaostris. I'm not good at these, but that's my best. I'll put a text right there. Well, I wouldn't call mermaid weed a rare plant in aquarium hobby. It is definitely not as widely available as some plants. While not picky about water conditions, all the information I can find on it says it prefers softer water, but it does good for me in hard water. The one thing about this plant that makes it a step above a beginner plant is that it does need to have at least what some people would call medium light. Basically, if this plant does not get enough light, it is not going to do good. In fact, my tanks just barely have enough light to grow it. In some of my brighter light setups, it even turns a nice red color as it grows closer and closer to the light. In high light setups, mermaid weed can turn a bright red. One of the biggest things that makes this plant so attractive are the serrations on the leaves. If you look closely, you'll be able to see the saw blade-like edges of the leaves. These serrations change depending on a couple of different factors. The first one being emerged, which means growing underwater, or immersed, which means growing up out of the water. Most of the plants that we keep in our tanks are actually plants that are underwater half the year during the rainy season, and up out of the water during the rest of the year, during the dry season. Many of these plants that transition from being underwater to being above the water have very different looking growth depending if it was grown underwater or up out of the water. Mermaid weed is definitely one of those plants. If you get mermaid weed with plain smooth leaves with little to no serrations, it is in its immersed form, which means it was grown up out of the water. The size and amount of leaf serrations is also dependent upon how much light the plant receives. If you look at the mermaid weed in my tanks, you can see that lower down where the light is less powerful, the leaf serrations are smaller and there are less of them, as well as the red becoming more and more visible the closer it gets to the light. While mermaid weed is indeed a stem plant, it is different than most stem plants that I've ever kept. It is definitely the slowest growing stem plant that I've ever kept by far, which can be a good thing, especially in smaller tanks. When you hold a mermaid weed stem, you can actually tell you're holding a plant. Most stem plants grown in water are just nothing when you hold them out of the water. They just a pile of glue. Guess what I'm trying to say is that mermaid weed is a much more substantial and rigid plant than most other stem plants that are grown in the water. Because of this, it will also put out a fairly hefty root system that can really take hold. While I haven't ever tried using root tabs or plant spikes under mermaid weed, I am willing to bet some kind of substrate enrichment would be appreciated by mermaid weed because of its big, extensive root system that it will put out. Keep in mind that because it is slow growing and pretty substantial for a stem plant, it is often quite a bit more expensive when compared to other stem plants. I honestly had never even heard of mermaid weed up until about 3 or 4 years ago. Before I started my website, markshelleyaquatics.com, I sold my shrimp wholesale hundreds at a time. The main guy I sold to had this really cool looking plant. Asked him what it was and if I could get a few stems to see what I could do with it. Told me it was called mermaid weed and pinched me off 3 or 4 stems. And now all these years later, I have it all over the place and it is easily my favorite stem plant. So now that I've got all the important information to you guys about mermaid weed that I scripted out and wanted to make sure I didn't forget anything, let's take a closer look at some of the aspects of this plant in closer detail. Here's a good tip if you want to grow mermaid weed without spending a fortune on a light. This is just a super old, really cheap Aqua Neat light. Look what we have here. This is a 20-gallon long, and since it is such a short tank, you don't need that much of a light, so you can get away, because obviously the further down the light has to shine, the dimmer it's going to be. So you can get away with growing plants like mermaid weed in shallower tanks. And like we said earlier, mermaid weed is very slow growing for a stem plant, which lends it to smaller, shorter tanks. But Ludwigi in this tank, she's there would be, it's up at the surface. I cut it all the way down to the bottom. It's up at the surface every week or two. So this probably takes 2 months for this to grow if I chop it down real low. And you can see, just like any other stem plant, where you cut it, it branches out and makes more stems. That's super cool. And over here in this tank, now, these little guys here, they have pretty good color, and look how fine the leaf serrations are. Now that's all the way down. You want to know why? Because I recently trimmed this tank. I cut out some portions and replanted the tops, and that's all you gotta do. You lop off the top, stick it in the bottom, and we'll grow some roots. Another thing to keep in mind with mermaid weed is you don't want to plant them too dense together like I've done here. So what happens, because they need so much light, the bottoms will end up shading themselves out and the leaves will just fall off. And all you'll have left is the top. So with this, I can take the opportunity to cut the bottom off here. I don't have to, but I'm going to show you guys what kind of roots we got growing on this guy. See, like it's starting to grow from the bottom. That's new and recent because it was all shaded out after trimming all of it, because this was all grown up to the surface, curling halfway out across the tank. Alright, hopefully I can pull this one stem out without making too big of a mess. I can show you guys the root system. It's all connected together. Cool. Now this has been in here a while. Look at the roots on this fella here. So you can see we got a pretty good root system. And so this guy's been shaded out. But look at the little tip growing there where I'd cut it. Well, that looks all right. So what we can do, little scissors, and chop. Now you really don't want to do this too often because you're stealing all the roots away. But this is kind of getting ugly. So what we're going to do, we're going to cut the roots, the bare stems off. Then we take these and we stick them back in the substrate. And now we've got, that's all there is to it. Like I said, it's just like any other stem plant. There's nothing different about that aspect of it whatsoever. So there you have it. Some things to know about mermaid weed, my most favorite plant to put in my shrimp tanks. Thank you guys for watching. Bye. Well, that's pretty right there.